Hey everyone, welcome back to High School Python. Before we dive into today's lesson, let's do a quick recap. In the last video, we learned how to take user input with the input function and display output using the print function. But now it's time to do something with that data. We want to process information, maybe even perform some simple math. But we get errors. At this stage, many new programmers get frustrated and think coding is too difficult. But here's the good news. The answer is simpler than you think. Why do these errors happen? Humans are incredibly smart. We understand that the same number can have different meanings depending on the context. If someone says 3, we know it could mean there are 3 of something, a jersey number, or even part of password. But computers? They don't think. They just follow instructions, exactly as given. Too often we are guilty of giving human characteristics to computers, when in fact, those characteristics are not really there. If we don't tell the computer what type of data it's dealing with, it gets confused. That's why understanding data types is a key step in coding. Today, we're going to learn what data types are, how to convert data from one type to another, casting. By the end of this video, you'll be able to avoid common beginner mistakes and write better Python code. Python has different types of data, but today we'll focus on the most important ones. String, used for text. Example, Alice. Integer, int, whole numbers. Example, 42. Float, numbers with decimal places. Example, 3.14. Boolean or bool, true or false values. We'll cover this more in a later video. For now, let's focus on strings, integers, and floats. Let's code. Let's say we want to calculate the total cost of buying some tickets for a show. We need 2 values. The number of tickets we wish to buy, this is a whole number. Number of tickets equals 3. And the ticket price, a decimal number. Price per ticket equals $5.99. Total cost equals number of tickets times price per ticket. Our code runs smoothly, and the total cost is calculated correctly. We can see the values in the variables panel. But what happens if we let the user enter the values themselves? Let's change our code to include some input functions so that our end user can decide how many tickets they want to buy and input the cost of a ticket. Now, when we run the code and enter 3 and $5.99, we get an error. Python tells us there's a type error. If I read the error message, I can see that I have a type error. Python is telling us that it can't multiply strings. But I thought we entered numbers. Python always treats input function data as a string by default. Even though the 3 and the $5.99 look like numbers, they're actually text. If you look at the variables panel, you can see they're surrounded by quote marks. Quote marks, you may have already realized, is how we tell Python to treat the data as text, which we refer to as a string. I have commented out line 7. Placing the hashtag in front of a line changes the code into a comment. So Python will ignore it as it no longer thinks of the line as code. And I have added 2 print functions at the bottom, along with the type function, so we can see what data types our variables are. This lets me see that both these variables are a string type. The problem is, we can't do math with strings. The input function will always return a string data type, no matter what it is we humans think we are entering. If I create an input function to get a person's age, I would expect them to enter a whole number or integer for their age and years. This person is 25, but Python will not understand this as the number 25. It treats it like two digits, 2 and 5. Digits can represent numbers, just like letters can represent sounds or words. So, we need to think of digits as just another text character, and we cannot do math with text characters. Remember, we said humans can change the meaning of numbers without even thinking about it. We think of the number 3 as just one thing. Here, 3 is just a digit, a way to mark this horse as different from other horses. We could just have easily have used letters. We understand that horse number 3 is not the same thing as 3 horses, and we didn't even have to think about it. Computers cannot do this. They need to be told if this is just a digit to represent one horse, or if this is the number of horses. As we will see shortly in our code example, when we multiply the digit 3 by the number 4, a computer will give us 4 of digit 3. But if we multiply the number 3 by the number 4, well, now we have 12 horses. These are clearly not the same thing. Before we ask the computer to do calculations, we need to change our strings to either integers or floats. This is called casting. To fix this error, we need to convert or cast the input from string to the correct data type before doing calculations. To cast a value to an integer type, we use the int function. We can turn a string, for example 25, into the integer 25. If we try and turn letters into integers, we get an error, because letters cannot be numbers directly. If I change a float to an integer, it drops everything after the decimal place. And we can of course change a variable from any data type into an integer data type. Let's go back to our calculator program and use the int function to cast our number of tickets variable from a string into an integer type. It is worth noting that the int function does not work in place. This means that we must assign the result of the int function to a variable. In other words, the variable number of tickets must be made equal to the integer version of the number of tickets. When I run the code and enter the same values as before, I can see from line 10 and in the variables panel that the number of tickets is now an integer data type. I will uncomment line 8. That means take away the hashtag to see if my calculation will run. And when I run my code again, I don't get an error message. But when I look in the variables panel, my total cost is not correct. Let's look and see what has happened. On line 8, we're multiplying the number 3 times the string 5.99. This means the shell would print 599 3 times. The computer doesn't show the quote marks, so this is the result. You may wonder why languages like Python would allow this to happen. But multiplying strings can come in useful. For example, if I want to print a line to divide up some information on the screen, or use a line of asterisks to make a pretty heading for my code, like I have done here. The ability to add two strings together, known as concatenation, is an important topic which will be covered in a later video. For now, we need to change our ticket price from a string to one of the number data types. And as money has decimal places, that data type will be a float. To cast data to a float data type, we use the float function. As with integers, we can change strings that contain digits. Or we can change integers. You see here, it adds a decimal place. We will get an error if we try and change text characters that are not digits. And of course, we can change the data type of a variable. So let's go back to our code and try out the float function. I want to use the float function to convert ticket price. Remember, this does not happen in place, so we must assign the new float type to the existing variable. When we run our code, we can see our two data types are now integer and float. I can now uncomment line number 9 so that our calculation happens correctly, and finally I want to print that result to the shell. And our code functions just fine. If you have a Python exam, remember that functionality is not everything. As we will see in our next video, most exams will have marks for the quality of your code. By that, we mean the design, how you go about solving the problem, and the types of functions that you use. Also, following good coding practices, such as making your code easy to read and understand. Or, as in this case, by not using the same variable for different purposes. Although the changes we are about to make will not affect the functionality of our code, it will help ensure by following best practice that we get better grades in examinations. Anytime we give exam tips in a video, the certificate icon you see in the bottom right corner will appear on your screen. Although it could be argued, we are not technically repurposing the ticket price variable. We are doing two separate things here. First, we're using it to input a string, and then casting it to a float for the calculation. So, it helps us explain and understand the idea of not repurposing variables. If we wanted to do both things, we should have used two variables, one for the input string and the other to store a float for a calculation. In this situation, we really only needed one variable. It is best practice to set the variable to the correct data type in the beginning and convert our string to an integer or float type before assigning it to that variable. We do this by placing the input function inside the float or int function. So we assign the variable as the correct type right from the beginning. Another important exam tip. Although it sounds very obvious, you would be surprised how often this doesn't happen. Always run your code to ensure it does not give errors before moving on to the next question. I have an error in my code. Reading the error message, I see it is a naming error. It is telling me the ticket price variable has not been defined, or the variable had not been created, so Python could not use it in this calculation. Due to all the changes I was making, I hadn't noticed that I left this string part of the name for my ticket price variable when doing the input. Now, my variable names are not consistent. Having a syntax error like this stops my code from running. Code that doesn't run will not get good grades. As I said before, always run your code and remove errors. But this one is a simple fix. I will just tidy up this variable name. Before we end the video, let's look at how we convert from number types, such as int and float, to string types. For this, we use the string function. Floats can be converted using the string function, as can integers. And of course, variables can be cast to a string type as well. We'll actually look at the string function more in a later video when we cover string concatenation. String concatenation is something that pops up frequently in Python exams. Final exam tips. Check your data types. If you get unexpected errors, use the type function or look in the variables panel to see what kind of data Python thinks you have. Always test your code. Run your program after making changes and ensure the examiner will not see errors when they run your code. Follow best practices. Assign values to the correct data type right at the beginning and don't change a variable's purpose halfway through your code. In this video, we saw 3 of the main data types. Learned how the input function always returns a string, the importance of choosing the right data type for each situation, and how to convert or cast data types using int, float, and string functions. You now have a coding challenge. Find and download the tax calculator Python file linked in the description below. Open it in Thonny and complete the 5 steps to get the program working. Pause the video and try to do that now. The solution will be shown after the final title clip. If you're studying for GCSE Computer Science or another high school qualification that uses Python, make sure to subscribe and like this video. I'll be making tons of Python videos packed with exam tips to help you get top marks. Got questions? Drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to help. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.